She was just a shy maid, until she greeted the Duke's father in a lost language. There are moments so small the world barely notices them. A door left ajar. A candle snuffed too early. A word spoken in the wrong room at the wrong hour, to entirely the wrong man. This is the story of one such word. A word that crossed 36 years of locked silence and landed, like a stone thrown into still water, inside the chest of a man who had spent a lifetime building walls precisely so that nothing could ever reach him there. She did not mean to shatter anything. She never does. That is the thing about a girl like her. She moves through the world the way morning light moves through old glass, quietly, without ceremony, without the faintest awareness of how much she changes every room she enters simply by breathing in it. She was just a maid. A shy, slight thing from the ancient northern hills of Yorkshire, with mud still on her boots and the smell of heather she hadn't yet managed to wash out of her hair. She had come to London to be invisible, to lower her eyes, to dust shelves and carry trays and say nothing that wasn't asked of her. But then she looked up, and she greeted him. Not in the clipped, careful English of the city, not in the rehearsed deference she had practiced on the long coach south. She greeted him the way her grandmother had greeted her grandfather every single morning of their lives, in a dialect so ancient, so particular, so utterly extinct to London ears, that the words hit him like a door blown open by a winter gale. Opposing her was the Duke's father, Sir Edmund, a man carved, it seemed, from the same grey stone as the manor walls, immovable, impenetrable, a man who had not been moved by a living soul in 4 decades. His very shadow made footmen straighten and housemaids hold their breath. He did not speak to servants unless the conversation was a correction. He did not look at them unless they had done something wrong. He looked at her now. He looked at her the way a man looks at a ghost. What she said in that forgotten tongue was simple. God keep your mourning, my lord. What it did to him was not simple at all. The autumn of 1820 arrived in London wearing its very best grey, which is to say it arrived looking precisely like every other autumn in London, which is to say, reluctant, damp, and faintly disapproving of everything beneath it. It was into this grey, into this disapproval, that Margaret Peggy Ashworth stepped down from a northbound coach. No, a southbound coach, her small trunk balanced on the cobblestones and her eyes wide with the specific terror of a girl who has never seen a city before and has just understood, viscerally, that the city does not care. She had a letter of placement. A good one, or so the agency had told her mother. Service at Webb House, Grosvenor Square. The household of Mr. Christopher Webb, the Duke of Ashmore, though she was already learning that in London, titles were worn like armor and wielded like weapons. She did not know, stepping through that servant's entrance for the first time, that the house was not simply a house. It was a monument to grief so old and so rigidly maintained that the very walls seemed to hold their breath. 36 years of silence had settled into its plasterwork like damp. 36 years since the mistress of the house, the Duke's mother, the late Lady Helena, had died in a room that had not been opened since. Peggy knew none of this. She knew only that the senior housekeeper spoke in whispers, that the other maids moved like shadows, and that somewhere on the upper floor, in room she was not to approach uninvited, lived an old man whose presence she felt before she ever saw him, the way you feel a drop in temperature before you understand a storm is coming. His name was Sir Edmund Webb. And 36 years ago, before grief had sealed him shut like a room with no door, he had loved a woman who spoke the old language of the northern hills. The same language, as it happened, that Peggy Ashworth had spoken every morning of her life. She did not know that yet either. She would learn it the morning she walked into the library, duster in hand, mind entirely elsewhere, and found him standing at the window and greeted him, out of pure nerves and pure instinct, in the only tongue that had ever felt like home. The glass he had been holding hit the floor, and 36 years of silence broke open like a wound, or perhaps more precisely like a window long painted shut that someone had finally thought to push. The tongue of the hills had found its way home. It had simply needed a shy girl with mud on her boots to carry it there. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Hit subscribe if you are hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The coach set her down at 7:30 in the morning, which was, Peggy would later think, precisely the right hour to arrive at a house that did not want you. Not that Webb House was unwelcoming in any obvious way. There were no locked gates, no snarling dogs, no butler with a face designed specifically to communicate rejection. There was simply stillness. The kind of stillness that is not the absence of noise so much as the presence of something heavier than noise. Something that had been there long enough to have settled into the foundations and decided to stay. She stood on the servant's step for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, her trunk at her feet, the London morning pressing its grey weight down on her shoulders, and she had the sudden, inexplicable feeling that the house was looking back at her, measuring her, finding her, in all likelihood, insufficient. She knocked anyway. She had not come this far to be intimidated by a door. The housekeeper who answered was a woman called Mrs. Poole, narrow, precise, with eyes the color of old pewter and a manner that suggested she had been born already disappointed. She looked Peggy up and down with the efficiency of a woman pricing livestock, said nothing for a moment that lasted slightly too long, and then stepped back to admit her without any particular warmth or ceremony. "You'll be the girl from Yorkshire," she said. Peggy confirmed that she would be. "We don't speak unless spoken to in this house," said Mrs. Poole, leading her down a corridor so quiet that Peggy's own footsteps sounded like an intrusion. "We don't sing. We don't hum. We don't drag our feet or let doors close behind us with any force. The Duke keeps irregular hours and is not to be disturbed. Sir Edmund keeps to his rooms in the mornings and is not to be approached under any circumstances without express instruction." She paused at a narrow staircase and turned to look at Peggy with the particular gaze of a woman who has said this speech many times and believes it has never, not once, been sufficiently heeded. "Do you understand?" Peggy said that she did. She did not entirely. Not yet. She understood the words. She had served before, not in a house like this, not in London, but she knew the grammar of service, the careful architecture of invisibility that a good maid was required to maintain. What she did not yet understand was the specific quality of the silence inside Webb House. It was not the silence of a household at rest, or of rooms waiting to be filled with ordinary living. It was the silence of rooms that had given up waiting. It was the silence of a place that had, at some point in the not-so-distant past, decided that warmth was no longer something it intended to offer. She was shown to a small room on the uppermost floor, a cold, white, serviceable room with a window that looked out over the square. She set her trunk down and stood for a moment with her hands clasped in front of her, the way she had stood as a girl in church, in the specific posture of a person trying to make themselves smaller than they actually are. Below her, the house breathed its cold, measured breath. She had grown up in a house where the kettle was always about to boil and someone was always laughing in the next room, and the wind off the moor came in through the gaps in the window frames, and the whole place smelled of peat smoke and bread and the particular damp wool of her father's coat hung by the door. She had grown up in a house that was entirely, unreservedly alive. Webb House was not alive. Or if it was alive the way certain very old things are alive, technically, stubbornly, without any apparent enthusiasm for the business. She unpacked her trunk with quiet, careful hands. She told herself it did not matter. She was here to work. She was here to be invisible, to be useful, to send money north and ask for nothing in return. She was not here to feel anything at all. She had absolutely no idea how wrong she was. She was sent to the library on her third morning. Not because she had done anything to deserve it, and not because she had been trusted with it. Mrs. Poole made clear, in the particular tone she reserved for instructions she expected to be mishandled, that the library was simply next on the rotation and that Peggy was simply the girl available. She was to dust the shelves along the east wall, leave the desk entirely untouched, and be finished and gone before the household stirred properly. She was given a cloth, a small pot of beeswax for the wood paneling, and a look that said, without any ambiguity whatsoever, "Do not break anything." She went up alone, in the grey early quiet, the candle in her hand throwing more shadow than light. The library was on the first floor, at the end of a corridor lined with portraits, men and women in various states of formal severity, each one staring out of their gilded frames with the expression of people who had been asked to sit still for a very long time and had made peace with it through sheer force of disapproval. Peggy kept her eyes forward and her footsteps soft. She had already learned in 3 days that Webb House rewarded the quality of being unnoticed. She pushed open the library door. The room was large and cold and smelled of old leather and something else beneath it. Something faintly floral, faintly feminine, so faint that she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. The shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, packed tight with volumes that had the look of books read once and then replaced with the reverence of objects that had outlived their original purpose. A fire had been laid in the grate but not lit. The curtains were half drawn, and the early morning light came through them gray and thin, like light that had been watered down. She set to work. She was methodical about it. She had always been methodical. It was one of the things her mother had called her best quality and her worst. Moving along the east wall shelf by shelf, cloth in hand, careful not to disturb the order of anything. The silence in the room was of a particular density. She found herself breathing more quietly than usual, as though the room itself required it. She was 3 shelves from the end when she heard him. Not footsteps. Not a door. Simply a presence. A shift in the quality of the air at her back. The way the temperature of a room changes when someone enters it who takes up more space than their body strictly accounts for. She turned. Sir Edmund Webb stood in the doorway. He was taller than she had imagined from the descriptions, and older, and somehow more everything. More still, more severe, more present. He wore a dark coat despite the early hour, his gray hair set back from a face that had been, in some previous life, probably handsome, and had since rearranged itself into something that simply meant authority. His eyes were pale and very steady, and they were fixed on her with the expression of a man who has found something in a room where he expected to find nothing. She froze. Every prepared thought she had, the curtsy, the quiet, "Good morning, sir," the careful, city-trained deference Mrs. Poole had drilled into her, every single one of it dissolved completely, because he was looking at her the way people at home looked at you, directly and without performance, and it stripped her of every layer of London she had managed to put on in 3 days. What came out of her mouth was not English. It was the greeting of the hills. Her grandmother's greeting. Her mother's greeting, every gray morning of her Yorkshire childhood. Offered without thought the way breathing is offered without thought. "God keep your morning, my lord." The words fell into the silence of the library like something dropped from a great height. Sir Edmund Webb went absolutely still. And then the glass he had been holding, which she had not even noticed until this moment, slipped from his fingers and hit the floor, and shattered, and neither of them moved to do anything about it at all. The glass lay in 3 pieces on the library floor, and nobody spoke. Peggy stood with her cloth still raised halfway to a shelf she would not finish dusting that morning, her heart doing something entirely undignified inside her chest, her mind moving at the specific speed of a person trying simultaneously to understand what has just happened and to calculate whether she is about to be dismissed for it. She had not meant to say it. She had not meant to say anything at all. The words had simply arrived, the way the old words always did, rising up through the careful English she had layered over them like groundwater rising through stone. Unstoppable. Unconscious. Entirely, catastrophically her own. Sir Edmund had not moved. That was the thing that frightened her most. Not the broken glass, not his silence, not even the way his pale eyes had gone very wide and then very still in a single arrested moment, but the fact that he had not moved. A man like Sir Edmund Webb, she had already understood, was a man in complete command of every room he entered. He arranged the air around himself. He did not stand in doorways with his hand open and an expression on his face that she could not name and was not sure she had any right to be witnessing. She dropped into a curtsy. It was the only thing she could think to do. "Forgive me, sir. I beg your pardon. I did not." He raised one hand. Not in anger. In something that looked impossibly like a request for silence. Like a man who has just heard a piece of music he had believed he would never hear again and cannot yet bear for anything else to interrupt it. She stopped speaking. He looked at her for a long moment. Looked at her the way you look at something you are not entirely certain is real. His jaw was set, but there was something working behind it, something that had no business being on the face of a man who had, by all household testimony, not been visibly affected by anything in the better part of 4 decades. A muscle moved beneath his eye. His hand, the one that had released the glass, was not quite steady. Then he turned and walked out of the room. No explanation. No correction. No dismissal. He simply left, and the door did not close fully behind him, and the sound of his footsteps retreated down the corridor at a pace that was almost, but not quite, controlled. Peggy stood in the middle of the library and breathed. She was still standing there, the broken glass at her feet and the beeswax pot clutched against her chest like a shield, when Christopher Webb appeared in the doorway. The Duke of Ashmore was not what she had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. He was younger than his household seemed to permit, somewhere in his middle 30s, with his father's height and his father's stillness, but something else beneath it, something that had not yet finished hardening. He looked like a man who had learned composure as a second language and spoke it fluently but not natively. His eyes went first to the broken glass, then to Peggy, then to the corridor his father had just vacated, and then back again. "What happened?" he said. His voice was even, carefully even, in the manner of a man who has trained himself out of every unnecessary inflection. Peggy opened her mouth and found, for the second time that morning, that she had no adequate language for what she needed to say. I greeted him, Your Grace. Only, I greeted him. I don't know what I said that." Christopher Webb was no longer looking at her. He was looking at the empty doorway through which his father had disappeared, and on his face was an expression she would come to know well in the weeks that followed, the expression of a man confronting evidence of something he had long since stopped believing was possible. His father had felt something. In 40 years, in this cold and sealed and airless house, Sir Edmund Webb had felt something, and it had been put there by a shy girl from Yorkshire with beeswax on her fingers and mud, still, faintly, in the seams of her boots. He told himself at first that it was simply a matter of household management. His father had been disturbed. Something the girl had said, some provincial expression, some northern peculiarity of greeting, had produced in Sir Edmund a reaction that Christopher had not witnessed in living memory, and it was entirely reasonable, entirely practical, for him to pay closer attention to the newest member of his staff until he understood what had occurred and whether it was likely to occur again. That was all it was. He was not a man given to curiosity for its own sake. He was a man given to the management of consequences, and this was simply consequence management. He believed this for approximately 4 days. On the 5th day he found himself pausing at the top of the servants' stair because he could hear her below in the entrance hall, polishing the brass fittings on the front door, and she was talking quietly to herself in a murmur he couldn't quite decipher. Not to anyone, not performing for anyone, simply talking the way people talk when they believe absolutely no one is listening. There was something about it that stopped him on the stair as cleanly as a hand placed flat against his chest. He did not go down. But he stood there for a moment longer than any reasonable account of himself would justify. The household of Webb House ran, as it always had, on a kind of elaborate and collective performance. This was not unique to his house. Christopher understood that all great houses operated this way, that the entire architecture of domestic service was a theater in which everyone knew their role and the quality of the production was measured by how completely the machinery was concealed. His footmen were excellent footmen. His cook was an excellent cook. Mrs. Poole was, in her own particularly gray fashion, an excellent housekeeper. They were all of them very good at being precisely and only what they were required to be. Peggy Ashworth was not. This was not to say she was bad at her work. She was not. She was quiet and careful and thorough, and she had learned the particular grammar of invisibility that Webb House required faster than most. But there was something that kept escaping the grammar. Small things. The way she looked at the portraits in the upstairs corridor, not with the careful blankness of a servant trained not to look too long, but with what appeared to be genuine and unguarded curiosity, her head tilting slightly, as though the painted faces were telling her something she was trying to follow. The way she touched the spines of books when she dusted them, not carelessly, not functionally, but with a brief and private tenderness, the tips of her fingers trailing along the lettering as though saying hello to old friends she hadn't known she'd find here. The way she occasionally, when she believed herself entirely alone, exhaled in a manner that was almost a sigh and looked out of whichever window she happened to be nearest, northward, always northward, with an expression that was not unhappiness exactly but was certainly the shape of someone holding a conversation with somewhere else. Christopher noticed all of it. He noticed it the way you notice something that is real in a room full of things that are merely convincing. He lived surrounded by performance, his own included, perhaps especially his own, and he had grown so accustomed to the texture of it that he had stopped registering it as performance at all. It had simply become the substance of his days. Managed, measured, appropriate. Every interaction in his household had its correct form and followed it faithfully. She did not follow it faithfully. She followed it carefully, which was an entirely different thing. Careful implied an original self beneath the compliance, something that was making considered choices about what to show and what to keep. Faithful implied there was no original self to manage in the first place. He found himself, increasingly, wanting to know what was underneath the careful. He found himself, which was more troubling still, watching the windows to see which direction she looked when she thought no one was there. It was always north. It was always, without exception, north. He had no idea what to make of that. He told himself he was not trying to find out. He was, of course, trying to find out. He chose a Tuesday evening, because Tuesday evenings were the one fixed point in the otherwise unmapped territory of his father's schedule. Every Tuesday, without variation, Sir Edmund took a glass of port in the east sitting room at 8:30. He did not invite company. He did not, as far as Christopher had ever been able to determine, particularly enjoy the port. It was simply something he did, in the way that Sir Edmund did many things, not out of pleasure or preference but out of the specific discipline of a man who has decided that structure is the only reliable substitute for feeling. Christopher had grown up watching his father build his days out of these small, immovable habits the way other men build walls, and he had learned, long ago, that the only way to reach him was to insert yourself into one of the gaps before the mortar set. He knocked and entered without waiting for an answer. His father was in the chair by the window, the port untouched on the table beside him, his hands folded in his lap with the careful deliberateness of hands that have been instructed to remain still. Sir Edmund looked up. He did not look surprised. He looked, if anything, as though he had been expecting this and had spent the intervening days deciding how much to give. Christopher sat down across from him without being invited and looked at his father in the direct, steady way he had spent most of his adult life practicing, because it had not come naturally and it had taken considerable effort to make it look as though it had. "The girl said something to you," he said. "In the library. I want to know what it was." His father was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, London moved through its evening with its usual indifferent efficiency, entirely uninterested in what was happening in this room. "She offered a greeting," Sir Edmund said at last. His voice was level. Extremely, deliberately level, in the manner of a man playing a very old instrument he had not touched in years and is being careful not to break. "In what language?" Another silence. Longer this time. "Your mother's language," said Sir Edmund. Christopher had prepared himself, reasonably well he'd thought, for a number of possible answers. He had not prepared himself for that one. He felt it land in the room between them and alter the temperature of everything. "I wasn't aware," he said carefully, "that my mother had a language." "Everyone has a language," his father said. "Most people simply speak the one they're given and never think about it further." He paused. "Your mother was not most people." He rose then, slowly, with the particular deliberateness of a man moving through something rather than away from it, and went to stand at the window with his back to the room. And then, for the first time in Christopher's memory, his father talked about her. Not the managed, formal references Christopher had grown up with, the brief, carefully bounded acknowledgments of her existence that Sir Edmund had always offered with the effect of a man reading from a document he had not written. He talked about her as though she had been real. As though she had been, and this was the word that kept arriving, unbidden and startling, in Christopher's mind as he listened, loved. Helena Webb, born Helena Marsh, had come from the northern hills as a young woman. She had carried with her, along with everything else she carried, a dialect spoken only in a handful of villages in the high country above the Dales, ancient, specific, largely undocumented, and almost entirely extinct everywhere except in the mouths of people who had learned it at their grandmother's knee. She had taught it to Sir Edmund in the early years of their marriage, slowly, privately, as a kind of gift, as a kind of country neither of them had been born in but both of them had chosen. It had been theirs alone. a door that only opened from the inside. "God keep your morning," Christopher said quietly. His father's shoulders moved. Just slightly. Just once. "It is how she greeted me," Sir Edmund said. "Every morning of our life together. Every single morning without exception, until the morning she could not." The port sat untouched on the table. The fire settled in the grate. And Christopher Webb sat very still in his chair and began, for the first time, to understand the precise dimensions of the silence he had grown up inside. She found the portrait on a Wednesday, which was, she would later think, the kind of detail that means nothing and somehow means everything. She had been sent to the small upstairs sitting room, not the grand rooms on the first floor that smelled of furniture polish and occasion, but the quieter room at the back of the house, the one Mrs. Poole referred to as the blue room, though it was not particularly blue. It was simply a room that had been overlooked. Not neglected exactly, but set aside, the way you set aside things you cannot bear to look at directly and cannot bear to throw away. It had the particular atmosphere of a room that had once meant something to someone and had been closed off precisely because of that. Peggy had been told to dust it thoroughly. She had not been told anything else about it, which was, she was learning, Mrs. Poole's standard way of communicating that there was something else about it. She worked her way around the perimeter methodically, the way she always did, shelf by shelf, surface by surface. There were small objects on the mantelpiece, a china dish, a pair of candlesticks, a folded fan that had gone brittle with age. There were books she did not touch and curtains she drew back carefully to let in the gray London light that always seemed to arrive in this house slightly apologetically. And then she turned to the wall beside the door, where a single portrait hung in a plain gilt frame, smaller than the ones in the corridor, more privately placed, the kind of portrait that is hung not for display but for keeping, for being near. She looked at it. She looked at it for a long time. The woman in the portrait was young, younger than Peggy was now, probably, painted in the manner of someone who has been asked to sit still and is making a sincere effort but finds stillness not entirely natural to her. Her hair was dark. Her eyes were light. She had a particular quality about the mouth, a kind of withheld expression, as though a smile had been recently retired and had not quite finished leaving. Peggy knew that mouth. She had watched it her entire childhood, across kitchen tables and through doorways and in the small square of mirror above the washstand in her mother's room. It was her mother's mouth. It was her mother's eyes and her mother's way of holding her hands and her mother's particular quality of being simultaneously present and slightly elsewhere, as though one part of her had never fully made the journey south from the hills. She took a step back. Then another. She was still standing there when she heard the door open behind her, and she turned to find Sir Edmund in the doorway. Not Mrs. Poole, not the Duke, but Sir Edmund himself, which meant he had come here deliberately, which meant this room was not as overlooked as it appeared. He looked at Peggy. He looked at the portrait. Something moved through his face with the speed and totality of a weather change. "Where," he said, very quietly, "are you from?" She told him. The village. The valley. The name of the farm above the low road. The one with the broken gate her father had been meaning to fix since before she was born. Sir Edmund crossed the room and stood before the portrait and was silent for so long that Peggy stopped breathing in any meaningful way. "Helena had a sister," he said at last, to the portrait rather than to her. "Younger by 4 years. When Helena came south, when she came to London to the life she built here, the sister could not follow. There were reasons. Family reasons, the kind that don't permit argument." He paused. Helena never recovered from leaving her. She wrote letters for years that were never answered. She spoke of her until the end. He turned then, and looked at Peggy with the eyes of a man standing at the edge of something enormous. "The sister's name," he said, "was Margaret." Peggy felt the room tilt very slightly on its axis. Her grandmother's name. Her grandmother, who had never spoken of a sister, who had kept certain silences the way the hills kept certain weathers, completely, and without any apparent intention of releasing them. Sir Edmund looked at her as though she were a letter that had taken 36 years to arrive. "You are," he said softly, "the spitting image of the woman I loved most in the world." She did not decide to leave so much as find herself leaving. That was how she would explain it later to herself in the quieter moments of the journey north, that there had been no single decision, No morning where she had risen and thought clearly and deliberately, "I am going." It had been more like the way water finds a crack in stone. Gradual, then sudden. Imperceptible, then inevitable. The days following Sir Edmund's revelation had been the strangest of her life, and Peggy Ashworth had not lived an entirely uneventful life. The old man had not spoken of it again. He had looked at her differently, not unkindly, not with the cold assessment of his earlier regard, but with something so much more difficult to bear than coldness. He looked at her the way you look at something precious that belongs to someone who is no longer there to receive it. He looked at her with 36 years of stored tenderness that had found, quite suddenly and without her permission, somewhere to go. She did not know how to be looked at like that. She did not know how to be the living answer to a grief she had not known existed until a fortnight ago. She was a girl from a farm above the low road, and she had come to London to dust shelves and send money home, and somewhere between the library and the blue room and the broken glass still occasionally surfacing in her thoughts, she had become something else entirely. Something the household needed her to be. Something the history of this family required her to carry. And then there was Christopher. That was the part she could not think about directly. She could only approach it sideways, briefly, in the way you approach a window when the light outside it is stronger than you are prepared for. He had not been inappropriate. He had not overstepped anything she could have named precisely to Mrs. Poole or put into words in a letter home. He had simply looked at her, talked to her on 2 occasions, in the corridor outside the library, with the door open and the household moving audibly around them, about nothing consequential. About Yorkshire. About the particular quality of northern light in autumn. About whether she found London cold, and she had said yes, and he had said he rather thought everyone did who came to it from anywhere that had honest weather, and she had almost smiled and then caught herself and looked away. That was all. That was the entirety of it. It was enough to frighten her completely. Because she understood, in the clear and unsentimental part of herself that had always been her most reliable compass, exactly what it meant and exactly what it could not mean. She was a maid. He was a duke. The history that had begun to unspool around her was not hers to rewrite, and the feeling that had begun to gather quietly in her chest when he was in a room, that particular awareness, that involuntary orientation toward him, the way a compass needle swings not because it chooses to but because it has no mechanism for doing otherwise, that feeling was not a thing she was entitled to, and it was certainly not a thing she was safe to keep. She wrote to her mother on a Thursday night. She packed her trunk on Friday morning, very early, before the house stirred. She left a note for Mrs. Poole that was correct and brief and thanked no one specifically for anything. She was at the coaching inn before 7. She sat inside the northbound coach with her trunk on the rack above her and her hands folded in her lap, and she looked out of the window at London receding, gray and indifferent as it had always been, and she told herself with great firmness that she had done the sensible thing, the necessary thing. That some doors, when you feel them beginning to open, are better gently closed before the draft gets in and changes everything. The coach turned north. The city thinned around her, and then the country opened up, and somewhere past the 3rd hour she smelled something through the window crack that might have been rain on moorland, and she closed her eyes and felt, beneath the confusion and the grief of leaving, the terrible relief of moving toward the only language that had ever truly been hers. She did not let herself think about what she was leaving behind. She thought about it the entire way home. He found his father in the corridor on a Saturday morning, standing before a door. Not moving. Not reaching for the handle. Simply standing before it the way you stand before something you have been circling for a very long time, close enough, finally, to feel its gravity but not yet certain you have the right to enter. The corridor was dim at that hour, the lamps not yet lit, and Sir Edmund was a tall, still shape in the half-light, his hand at his side, his head slightly bowed, not in defeat, Christopher thought, but in something closer to preparation. The posture of a man gathering himself for the most important thing he has done in decades. Christopher recognized the door. He had known it his entire life without ever being permitted to know it. It was the door at the end of the upper corridor, the one that had been locked for as long as he had been alive, and before that, the one that Mrs. Poole referenced only in the passive voice and the other servants did not reference at all. His mother's room, sealed the morning after she died by Sir Edmund's own hand, and not opened in 36 years. Not for cleaning, not for inventory, not for any of the 100 practical reasons that might have justified it. Sealed because Sir Edmund had decided it would be sealed, and what Sir Edmund decided had, in this house, always had the force of permanent weather. Christopher stopped at the far end of the corridor and did not announce himself. He understood, with the instinct of a man who had spent a lifetime reading the silences of this house, that to speak now would be to break something that needed to remain intact. His father stood before the door for a long time. And then, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man performing an action he has rehearsed only in his mind and is discovering, in the execution, to be both harder and simpler than he imagined, Sir Edmund raised his hand and placed it flat against the wood. Not the handle. The wood itself. The way you place a hand on the shoulder of someone you have wronged and are not yet ready to speak to but need, urgently, to touch. His head dropped further. His shoulders, those immovable architectural shoulders that Christopher had watched hold their line through every difficulty of his adult life, moved once. Just once. With the specific, suppressed movement of a man who is crying and has so little practice at it that his body barely knows the mechanism. Christopher turned away. He walked back along the corridor, then down the stairs, then through the entrance hall, and he did not stop walking until he was in his study with the door closed behind him. He stood at his desk and looked at the surface of it, the letters, the ledgers, the entire managed apparatus of his days, and he felt something shift in his chest with a slow tectonic finality, the way ground shifts after a long frost when the thaw finally comes. His father had waited 36 years. 36 years of sealed rooms and port left untouched and a face kept so perfectly still that his own son had grown up believing that stillness was simply what men were made of. 36 years of standing in corridors outside doors, gathering himself. And the gathering had taken everything. It had taken his warmth and his voice and all those ordinary Tuesday evenings, and every morning he might have looked at his son and said something that was true. Christopher did not want to wait 36 years. He was not certain, standing there with the gray London light coming through the study window, that he was capable of it even if he'd wanted to, because she had been gone 4 days and the house was already different. Not quieter. It was no quieter than it had always been. But emptier. Emptier in the specific way of a place from which something real and particular has been removed, leaving behind only the things that were always just performing at being real. He pulled on his coat. He opened the study door and told the footman in the hall to have his horse saddled within the hour. Then he went upstairs to pack for the north. He had never been to Yorkshire in autumn. He understood, riding north through the slow transformation of the landscape, why people who came from this country never entirely left it, even when they did. It did not announce itself the way the South did, with its managed hedgerows and its self-satisfied villages and its countryside that always looked faintly like a painting of countryside rather than the thing itself. The North arrived gradually and then all at once, the hills rising out of the flat Midlands like a change of subject, the sky dropping lower and wider, the light becoming something entirely other than what London called light. It was not pretty in any conventional sense. It was something larger than pretty. It was the kind of landscape that made you feel simultaneously very small and very awake. He stopped once on the second day, on a ridge above a valley that opened below him in tones of amber and deep green and the particular exhausted purple of heather at the end of its season, and he sat on his horse in the wind and thought about his mother. About a young woman who had carried all of this inside her, this sky, this scale, this specific quality of silence that was nothing like the silence of Webb House because it was alive, because it was full of wind and weather and the distant sound of water running over stone, and had brought it south to London and watched it, slowly, become something she could only access in a language no one around her spoke. He understood her better on that ridge than he had managed in 36 years of living in her absence. He rode on. Peggy's village was smaller than he had imagined, which was to say it was exactly the right size for what it was, and he had been imagining it through London eyes. A cluster of stone houses in a fold of the hills, a church, a lane that turned to track at its northern end, and above it all the more opening out in every direction with the frank, unhurried immensity of something that has been here considerably longer than anyone's trouble and intends to remain considerably longer still. He found the farm without difficulty. There was only one with a broken gate. He dismounted in the yard and stood for a moment, his horse breathing beside him, the wind moving through the long grass at the field's edge with a sound like a conversation just out of earshot. The farmhouse was low and stone-built and had the solid, undemonstrative quality of a place that has weathered everything and made no particular fuss about it. Smoke from the chimney. A dog somewhere announcing him without urgency. The door opened. She stood in the doorway in a gray dress without the apron and cap, her hair not arranged in the careful manner of service but simply herself, down, slightly wind-disordered, the way it must have been before London had taught her to pin everything in place. She looked at him with an expression that moved through several things very quickly. Surprise, confusion, something she closed over almost immediately that he recognized because he had been watching its equivalent in himself for weeks. Then her chin went up. Just slightly. The particular angle of someone who has made a decision and intends to hold it. "Your Grace," she said. Careful. Correct. The London voice, placed between them like a piece of furniture. Christopher looked at her for a moment. Looked at her the way he had been looking at her for weeks, except that he was no longer pretending to himself that there was any other reason for it than the true one. Then he took his hat off because it seemed right, because some gestures are older than their manners, and he spoke. Not in English. Slowly, imperfectly, with the pronunciation of a man who had spent 4 nights on the road memorizing something by firelight from notes he had made from everything his father had told him. He offered her the greeting of the hills. "God keep your morning." The wind moved through the long grass. Peggy Ashworth stood in the doorway of her mother's house and looked at the Duke of Ashmore, who had ridden 4 days north to speak 6 words in a dead language on a broken-gated farm, and something in her face stopped managing itself entirely. She stepped back from the door. Not away from him. To make room. "You had better come in," she said in the old tongue. And he did. And that is where we leave them. Not at a grand altar. Not in a ballroom with the whole of London watching. We leave them exactly where the story was always going. In a low stone farmhouse in the fold of the Yorkshire hills, with the wind outside and the fire inside and 2 people sitting across from each other in the oldest language either of them has ever spoken, finally, at last, saying true things. Sir Edmund opened the door. He did not walk through it, the same man who had stood before it for 36 years. None of them did. That is the thing about sealed rooms. They do not stay sealed forever. Grief is patient, but so is love, and love has a far longer memory. Peggy did not mean to change anything when she walked into that library. She never does. That is exactly why she changed everything. And Christopher Webb, the Duke of Ashmore, rode 4 days north in the autumn wind with 6 words in a dying language and a broken gate in a Yorkshire yard, and chose, finally, irrevocably with his whole chest, the man's heart over the Duke's duty. The sealed rooms are open. The language of the morning is spoken again. And somewhere in the hills, if you are very quiet, if you stand in the right kind of silence, not the cold London kind, but the living kind, the kind that is full of wind and heather and the distant sound of water, you can still hear it. God keep your morning. And now, at last, someone does. If this story found something in you, if it sat with you the way the old words sat with Sir Edmund, quiet and sudden and more true than you were prepared for, then do something small for me before you go. Like this video. It takes 1 second and it tells me that stories like this one are worth telling. Subscribe to this channel and turn on your notification bell, because the next story is already waiting, and I would hate for you to miss the moment it begins. I read every comment. Every single one. So tell me, have you ever said something innocent that changed everything? Have you ever walked into a room and, without meaning to, shattered something that needed to be broken? Leave it below. I will be there. Until the next story, God keep your morning.